Good morning. It's a beautiful, sunshiny day, spring day this morning. It's good to see everyone. We have a lot of our own people out, but we have a lot of visitors here with us, and we're thankful that you've come to worship God with us today. We're going to look at the first miracle recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And if you were in the adult class this morning here in the auditorium, you know something about my own enthusiasm for the Gospel of John. I am excited about this gospel. There are so many layers of meaning there, and I tried to communicate that to the class this morning. But you have in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, this wedding that takes place at Cana of Galilee, and the first miracle of turning water to wine. And so read the text with me, if you will. I'll have a couple of slides that will accompany the reading of the text if you like to kind of have one eye on the scripture and the other eye on the slides. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it was from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first. And when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Cana of Galilee. It's kind of an abrupt transition between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. But the one bridge that connects the two is that Nathanael, who occupies a good chunk of the last paragraph of chapter 1, is from Cana of Galilee, according to chapter 21 and verse 2. There are a couple of identifications of Cana, but it was probably about 10 miles north of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, in the region of Galilee, somewhat southeast of Capernaum, which is where Jesus makes his home with Peter and Andrew, James and John, as his base of operations for his earthly ministry. So Jesus has collected a few disciples up to this point. Probably hasn't chosen his 12 apostles yet, although the inner circle is already forming. You have implications of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, Philip, Bartholomew, Nathanael in chapter 1. And it's amazing to me that Jesus is not only invited, but his disciples are invited with him to this wedding feast. Now, Jesus was a man of the people. Unlike John the Baptist, who was a desert rat and one who was anything but a social, gregarious kind of person. And when Jesus identifies John as being the great one that he is, he challenges the people in Luke chapter 7. Who did you go out in the wilderness to see? Was he a man dressed in soft raiment? Did John wear a tuxedo? No. He wore camel's hair and a leather belt. He ate locusts and wild honey. He preached a stern message. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And people didn't like that. At least the Jewish religious leaders didn't like it. Common people did. They knew he was a prophet of God. The religious leaders dismissed him. But they also dismissed Jesus. So one of the other things that Jesus does in Luke chapter 7 as he's extolling the greatness of John is he thinks out loud. It's a teaching device. To what shall I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They're like children sitting in the marketplace who call out to one another. We played the flute for you, but you did not dance. We sang a dirge for you, but you did not mourn. For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say, he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, a glutton and a drunkard, friend of tax collectors and sinners. You come with the packaging of John the Baptist, he's not social enough. You come with the packaging of Jesus, he's too social. Don't like the message, slay the messenger. John the Baptist, Jesus, doesn't matter, don't like the message. But it was on occasions such as this, right here in John chapter 2, where Jesus earns the tag, glutton and a drunkard, friend of tax collectors and sinners. Socially gregarious, man of the people, going to social occasions, eating, drinking. He was not a glutton and he was not a drunkard, though. He was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But mixed with partial truth is a whole lot of embellished falsehood. But that's what people do when they don't want to take someone seriously. They misrepresent him. And so at this point, Jesus is not well known yet. But he's well known enough to the family of the groom to be invited to a wedding feast and his disciples. Not only so, but Mary plays a leading part. She plays a central role behind the scenes at the wedding, so much so that some have assumed that she may have even been assisting in the provisions and the serving. Therefore, it is plausible that this wedding involves some close friends or extended family members of Jesus. Perhaps he was invited because he was Mary's son. Perhaps his disciples were invited because the family was well known to this family. There's an interesting interplay here between mother and son that fundamentally changes the nature of the relationship. Mothers have special relationships with their sons. And Jesus was Mary's firstborn. And he was a special child, and she knew that before he was born. And you can just imagine the nature of Mary and the nature of her son. And here you have a wedding which in Jewish culture lasts up to a week. Unlike our social custom of the bride's family footing the bill, it was the groom's responsibility to provide for the wedding guests. And when the wine ran out, Mary, in panic mode, says to Jesus, "They have no wine." It's a simple statement, but there are loaded implications behind the words. Her statement is really a request. Jesus understood people. He was a good listener, but he also needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Verse 25. He understood people, and he was able to read their emotions, their thoughts, their innuendos. He intimately knew the motivational driving force behind every person. He was able to read people because he had supercharged antennas, if you will. He could look at you and know everything about you. And people communicate differently. Women tend to communicate a little differently than men. Those are generalizations, but Mary was an emotional communicator. If you don't get that from this, you certainly get it in the first two chapters of Luke, probably traceable to the eyewitness testimony of Mary. Mary's fingerprints are all over the first two chapters of Luke. And she's not only in a position to give firsthand testimony of most of the episodes in those first two chapters of Luke, but the account is wrapped around her emotional gut reactions at every turn. Verse 34 of Luke chapter 1, "How can this be since I am a virgin?" she says to the angel. Luke 1:42, Elizabeth exclaims with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women," said to Mary. Luke 1:56, Mary remained with her about 3 months and then returned to her home. It's Mary's perspective. Luke 2, verse 19, Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. Luke 2:34 and 35, they present baby Jesus in the temple, and Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, for a sign that is opposed, and the sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that the thoughts from many hearts may be revealed." In other words, this child is destined for greatness, but it will cost you personally. And it'll be like a sword piercing your own heart when it all comes about. You have incidental details, again reflective of Mary's perspective. Luke 2:41. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. Luke 2:51. His mother treasured up all these things in her heart. Luke 2:48. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." She's an emotional communicator. So when she says to a full-grown Jesus at a wedding feast, "Son, they have no wine," the implication is, what are you going to do about it? And Jesus very gently but firmly pushes back. When she says they have no wine with loaded implications, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? Mine hour has not yet come." I think that what Mary may be pressing for prematurely is for a full revelation of Jesus' glory and his true identity, as well as a vindication of the family name among all those friends and relatives. Because I'm going to tell you something, in a small town like Nazareth, with relatives in Cana, just 10 miles or so away, when families know families and a woman is impregnated in her virginity, Do you think for a moment that there wasn't a ton of talk for all those years? Now, son, you just flex those supernatural muscles and you vindicate the family name right here and right now, and it will all be good and all be glorious, and everybody will know that this was not done in an immoral way, but to the glory of God, and all of this will finally be made known, and Jesus throws cold water all over it. Now is not the time. Not yet. But make no mistake about it, if anyone on earth knew that Jesus was truly the Son of God, it was Mary. And now we finally have a chance to set the record straight. Show your glory. No, now is not the time. Jesus fully understands what she wants of him, and he's not willing to go all the way with that. So she acquiesces to whatever he's willing to do. Do whatever he tells you to do. And she says that very publicly here, which means that she leaves the initiative entirely up to him, but she also puts him on the spot. Do whatever he tells you to do. My hour, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Do whatever he tells you to do then. Say this too. He calls her woman. And culturally, that's not quite the faux pas that it might be in our society. I don't advise any of you men to go around calling your significant females in your life woman. Just don't advise it. But think, dear woman or madame or something along those lines. When Jesus sees Mary Magdalene after the resurrection at the side of the grave, it's woman. So that was common in that culture to address a lady that way. But I have to say this too, that he does call her woman. And even though there's a formality there and an acceptable, within the acceptable range of speech, it still doesn't quite come as close to mother or mom or even Mary. It's woman, which does put a tinge of psychological distance there. And it does establish something fundamental about the relationship going forward, especially when he adds the words, what to me and to you, which is usually translated something like, what does this have to do with me? Why come to me with this? And so it does suggest at least a mild form of detachment. And Jesus will have tender feelings for his earthly mother, but her agenda will not be what drives God's agenda. And he sets that straight from the get-go here. She wants him to do all of this and to vindicate the family and so on. And he's not going to do that. The hour is not right for that. Someone else in the crowd a little bit later on will praise Jesus indirectly by praising his mother. In Luke 11:27 and 28, as he said these things, a woman in the crowd raised her voice and said, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast at which you nursed." In other words, you must have an incredible mother. And he did. But he responded, Luke 11:28, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it. And I want to say this, that never in the New Testament do you see Mary as any kind of object of worship. It's just not there. If anything, Jesus goes out of his way time and time again to distance ourselves from any hint of that. Woman, what does this have to do with me? But he does go ahead and he performs this amazing miracle. And this is said about that miracle down in verse 11. This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And so even though this miracle tends to fly under the radar, it's not like a magical trick where a magician is trying to call attention to himself and, Jesus the Magnificent. No one knows about this except those in the inner circle. Go fill these enormous water pots with water and then draw from them, and the water has turned to wine. And they're water pots, and they're evidently empty at this point. They're used for Jewish purification. When the guests arrive, they're all washed up. Talked about that concept before. And evidently they need to be replenished, refilled. So the water has been used. They go down and get water, and they bring it back, and they begin to draw it, and the water is transformed. It's changed. These are not wine vessels, they're water pots. But somehow, some way, when they draw, they get wine. And it's not only any run-of-the-mill ordinary wine, it's the best there is. Now again, I'm going to reiterate, I don't believe for a moment Jesus is a glutton or a drunkard. And I could preach an entire separate sermon on wine as a table beverage in the Mediterranean world. There is ample evidence in reams that wine as a table beverage in the Mediterranean world was often mixed with 3 or 4 parts of water to 1 part wine at minimum. So much so that commentators who are acutely aware of that say that it's possible to get drunk using that table beverage, but typically the mixture would affect the bladder long before it affected the mind. There's a lot of instruction in the New Testament against drunkenness, against improprieties of that nature. But wine was a table beverage, and whatever Jesus produces here is the best there is. And he manifested his glory by doing it, even though this tends to fly under the radar, and his disciples believe in him. But there's something more that we could say about that. Something that I was thinking a lot about this week as I was thinking about preaching this. If I were doing this, I don't think that I would produce the first miracle as something that was so seemingly mundane or just not sensational enough. Only a few people know about this. It doesn't satisfy Mary's longing to really make a grand display of it all. You have the servants know, the disciples know, and it's just kind of, okay, the bridegroom serves the best at the end, and other people don't even seem to know about it. And, if you're going to prove that you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, can't you do something more important than turning water to wine? Something more sensational than that seems so insignificant. Here's my thoughts on that after I've done a little more thinking. The value judgments we place can betray our moral priorities. And if we think that this isn't significant enough, it's not grand enough, it's not glorious enough to show disciples that Jesus is the Son of God when they believed in him, witnessing that, it may be a deficiency in us. Because God may value something infinitely more highly than we do. And here's what I want to say about that. If you don't think that this is important enough as a first miracle, then maybe God values holy matrimony, weddings, social interaction, and occasions for human celebration higher than you do. Maybe these things are infinitely more important to God than they are to us, and that this is the perfect first miracle for Jesus to perform in light of how important these things are to God. How important is holy matrimony to God? Jesus' first miracle puts its stamp of approval on holy matrimony. How important is the human celebration of the greatness of holy matrimony to God? Jesus fills in what is needed when it's totally lacking. And that says something. I wonder, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first? Holy matrimony between a man and a woman? Or the relationship between Christ and his church? Which was modeled after which? I need only remind you that the same John who wrote this chapter also wrote in John the 19th chapter about the marriage feast of a much greater groom and a much greater bride, much greater wedding. So when you think about it, there's something fundamental about us that is made especially for these things. And when you look at the bigger picture of Jesus addressing needs, what created the need? I don't know if it was carelessness or poor planning or poverty or human inadequacy of some sort, but I'd say that this bridegroom either didn't have it all together financially or organizationally, because halfway through the feast, the wine runs out. Mary's in panic mode. He either didn't have enough wherewithal to pay the bill necessary to get enough wine there, or it was extremely poor planning. Who was responsible for the glitch? The bridegroom was. The master of the feast goes to the bridegroom. Usually you serve the better wine first, and then when their taste buds are all messed with, then you serve the cheap stuff. You serve the cheap stuff first. And now you've got the best there is at the end. That's just counterintuitive. Maybe he didn't have a lot in terms of wherewithal to serve the good stuff even at the beginning, and to have enough supply on hand to last the full week. So when Jesus meets the need, he fills the void, and he shows us a glimpse of something on a much grander scale. That he's there to glorify holy matrimony, to glorify the celebration of holy matrimony, to glorify the human interactions that go along with the joyous fellowship of those celebrations, It is a small foretaste of what we read about in Revelation 19, the marriage feast of the Lamb. Now all of a sudden, this isn't so insignificant, is it? But there's also the rest of the story. There's one other time where Mary comes up in this gospel. Like you skip a bunch of information in between, and then she comes up again, all of a sudden. She comes up only twice in the Gospel of John. Right here at a wedding feast in Cana. Okay, son, now's the time. No, it's not the time. And then she comes up again, and it is the time. His hour had come this time. And he is crucified. His limbs are affixed by nails to a piece of wood. And he looks down on a crowd. And he sees his mother. And he doesn't call her Mary or mother or mom. He calls her woman, just like he did in John chapter 2. Woman, behold your son. John 19:26. Simeon's prophecy was realized. A sword will pierce through your own soul. As Jesus' life was eking away on the cross, the sword was piercing through her. And you can imagine how painful that was to her. But he also says to the disciple whom he loved, who wrote these words, behold your mother. And there it's not behold the woman, it's behold your mother. Because he couldn't take care of her physically anymore. So he entrusts her care to his trusted disciple, John. So what Mary wanted to happen at a wedding in Cana was now being realized on a cross outside of Jerusalem, but in a very different way than she might have realized. Earthly relationships will not override God's agenda. Mary was never intended to be an object of worship. Jesus addresses her again as woman, but very different circumstance. But he would say, John 12:32, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. It's at the cross that everything Mary wanted to happen at a wedding would now finally be realized. There's one other thing I want to bring out as we bring all of this to a close. Something to think about. If Jesus can turn water into wine and speed up those processes miraculously so that something mundane and tasteless suddenly becomes precious, the best there is. If he can take an ordinary substance from a contribution almost anyone can make and turn it into something special, then what can he do with you? What can he do with your life? If your life is mundane and ordinary, what can he do with that? He can take water and turn it into wine. What can he do with your life? Make it extraordinary. I want you to think about that as we stand and sing the song of invitation.